You ever notice how two people can look at the exact same set of facts and walk away with two completely different stories? Well, that's exactly what we're diving into right now. We're going to use the long, complicated relationship between the US and Iran as our case study. It's a conflict that you can see through two totally different lenses, and it all boils down to one simple question. Where do you start the story?
Okay, so let's get into it. Our storytellers are Condoleezza Rice, former Secretary of State, and David Stockman, who used to be the budget director. Now, these are both White House veterans. They know the machinery of American foreign policy inside and out. And yet, when they look at the same history, they tell stories that just don't add up together. How is that even possible? That's the puzzle we're going to try to solve.
All right, let's start with the first narrative. This one's championed by Condoleezza Rice. For her, this is a story of aggression, which frames America's response as just necessary vigilance, watching out for a hostile regime.
This quote from Rice, it's pretty powerful. She doesn't see this as some recent flare-up. For her, this has been an active war waged against the United States for decades. And notice her wording there. They have been at war with us. In her world, the responsibility, the blame, it lies squarely with Iraq.
So where does her story begin? It starts right here in 1979 with the Iranian Revolution and the U.S. Embassy seizure. And from that point, she draws a straight line to the 1983 bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut, which was attributed to Hezbollah, and then right on through the decades of what she sees as just this constant pattern of Iranian-backed proxy warfare. It's a very clear, very linear story of unprovoked hostility. So what's the lesson from this point of view? It's pretty clear. For Rice, history teaches us to be vigilant. The real danger here is complacency. Failing to confront a hostile actor early on, that doesn't bring peace. It just invites a much bigger danger later on.
Okay, now let's completely flip the script. Let's look at David Stockman's version. He tells a totally different story, not one of aggression, but of blowback. And for him, the main theme is American intervention. Remember that 1983 Beirut bombing? For Rice, that was a starting point. But for Stockman, it's a reaction. He doesn't see it as some unprovoked act of aggression. He sees it as a predictable, tragic consequence of putting U.S. troops right in the middle of a super complex civil war. It's a symptom of what he calls imperial overreach.
And look at this timeline. Stockman rewinds the clock way further back than Rice. His story doesn't kick off in 1979. Oh no, it starts in 1953 with the CIA-backed coup that got rid of Iran's prime minister. He argues that that single event created decades of resentment, which is what actually fueled the '79 revolution. Then he points to U.S. support for Iraq in the Iran-Iraq War. In this telling, the 1983 Beirut bombing isn't a starting point at all, it's blowback, an unintended consequence of things the U.S. did first.
So, the big takeaway here is the polar opposite of Rice's. The great danger isn't being complacent, it's intervening too much. Stockman's lesson is that this kind of overreach carries huge, often unforeseen risks. Sometimes great powers can actually end up creating the very enemies they later have to fight.
And this brings us right back to our central mystery. We've got two smart, experienced people looking at the exact same historical record and telling stories that are just fundamentally at odds. I mean, this isn't just a simple disagreement on policy. It's a disagreement on what reality even is. The key to solving this puzzle, believe it or not, comes from a field you might not expect: economics.
To really unlock this, we need a different kind of lens. We have to look beyond just the events themselves and start thinking about the powerful, often invisible incentives that shape how we see those events. And for that, we're going to turn to something called public choice theory.
Now, don't let the name scare you. The core idea is actually super simple. It basically says that small, highly organized groups who stand to gain a whole lot from a certain policy, well, they're going to fight way, way harder for it than the large, disorganized public who will each only bear a tiny little piece of the cost. And that creates this huge imbalance in how policies get made.
So how does this actually play out in foreign policy? Well, on one side, you've got these concentrated interests. Think defense contractors, security agencies, think tanks, and political leaders who really need to look strong and decisive. They're organized, they're well-funded, and they have a direct stake in the game. But on the other side, the costs are spread thinly across millions of taxpayers, soldiers, their families, and the economy as a whole. Those costs are diffuse, disorganized, and a lot of times they're totally invisible in the debate.
And make no mistake, those costs are very real. We're talking about money and talent getting sucked away from productive parts of the economy. We're talking about distorted investments, even inflation. But the most significant cost, of course, is the human one. These costs are massive, but because they're scattered across the whole of society and even across generations, they almost never have an organized lobby fighting for them in the halls of power.
Okay, so with that whole idea of hidden incentives in our back pocket, let's look back at our two storytellers, Rice and Stockman, and see how this all connects.
So you see, their stories aren't just random opinions. They are totally shaped by their professional vantage points. Rice spent her whole career inside the national security machine, where your number one job is to find and neutralize threats. Her entire world is defined by the fear of complacency. Stockman, on the other hand, made his name as a budget guy, fighting government growth. His world is defined by the fear of overreach. Each one sees the dangers most clearly from the place where they stand.
This brings us to a really old piece of wisdom from the Temple of Apollo in ancient Greece. The inscription read, "Know thyself." It's a call for self-awareness, right? A reminder that real understanding starts by looking at our own perspective, our own biases, and our own starting points.
We can think of this as the Delphic mirror. It's a metaphor for the kind of self-reflection we need to bring to these huge, important stories. The goal isn't just to pick a side, Rice or Stockman. The real goal is to understand how these stories are built in the first place. It's asking us to look at the storyteller just as much as we look at the story.
And that brings us to the last and maybe the most important question of all. Where does the story begin? Because as we've seen, if the story starts in 1979, the lesson is vigilance. But if it starts in 1953, the lesson might be that great powers often create their own problems. Where the story begins almost always determines where the argument ends. The real challenge, then, isn't just choosing a story, but understanding why each one starts where it does.